Welcome to While We Were Distracted, the podcast where we explore topics that often get overshadowed in the rush of daily life.
All right, so let's dive into something pretty unique. We're talking about Osama bin Laden's bookshelf. You heard that right. Imagine getting a peek into the mind of one of history's most notorious figures through the books and documents he consumed.
It's a fascinating opportunity, really, to try and understand, the information environment that shaped bin Laden's worldview, especially during his time in hiding.
Exactly. And for this deep dive, we're focusing on one specific document from the trove of materials released from his compound. It's a PDF titled America's War on Terrorism by Michel Chossudovsky.
And keep in mind, this is just a starting point, right? There are gigabytes of data that were declassified and released, and we will deep dive into more of it as we go. But for now, we're going to analyze this book and try to understand how it might have informed bin Laden's perspective on the U.S. and the war on terror.
Right, so let's unpack this from the very beginning. Chossudovsky expresses skepticism towards the official 9/11 narrative. He digs into al-Qaeda's origins and ideology, attempting to present an alternative viewpoint.
Yeah, and one detail that really stands out is Chossudovsky's personal experience researching the Macedonian NLA, where he claims to have encountered U.S. military advisors working alongside al-Qaeda operatives just months before 9/11. He uses this as evidence to support his claim that the U.S. government had a pre-existing relationship with al-Qaeda, a theme that runs throughout the book.
And that leads to one of the book's most provocative arguments, that the war on terror wasn't solely a response to 9/11, but rather a pre-existing agenda that was simply put into action after the attacks.
Yeah, Chossudovsky goes even further, suggesting that this war on terror was used as a tool to erode civil liberties and create what he calls a police state. He specifically points to the Patriot Act in the U.S. as an example, arguing that it granted the government sweeping surveillance powers and criminalized dissent. He defines left accommodation as the failure of left-leaning groups and individuals to effectively challenge this erosion of civil liberties, essentially allowing the government to operate unchecked.
He paints a pretty bleak picture of power dynamics and motivations, claiming that those potentially complicit in war crimes were the ones shaping the legal systems that were supposed to hold them accountable.
Right now, let's turn our attention to bin Laden himself. Chossudovsky portrays him as a direct product of U.S. foreign policy, someone who was trained and supported by the CIA during the Soviet-Afghan War. In fact, he repeatedly claims that al-Qaeda was, and potentially still is, a U.S. intelligence asset.
He even mentions an alleged meeting between bin Laden and a CIA agent in Dubai just weeks before 9/11, further adding to the intrigue.
Yeah, and he casts doubt on bin Laden's whereabouts on 9/11 itself, suggesting he may have been hospitalized at the time. This all feeds into the narrative that Chossudovsky is constructing, a web of hidden agendas and complex relationships where things aren't always as they seem.
Now, America's war on terrorism also delves deep into the world of geopolitics, specifically the strategic importance of oil and gas reserves in Central Asia.
Chossudovsky argues that the U.S. was driven by a desire to control these resources, seeking to bypass the influence of Russia and Iran in the region.
And this is where Afghanistan and the Trans-Afghan Pipeline project come into play. The book claims that the U.S. sought to control this pipeline, favoring Unocal, an American oil company, over its Argentinian competitor Bridas during the Taliban's rule. This detail helps paint a clearer picture of the economic forces that Chossudovsky argues were at play.
He also highlights Chechnya, a region crucial for Russian pipeline routes, and accuses the U.S. of supporting Chechen rebels to destabilize Russia and gain control of its energy resources.
It's as if Chossudovsky is trying to show how the war on terror was deeply intertwined with the larger struggle for energy dominance, with oil and gas acting as key motivators.
Yeah, and throughout the book, there's this constant emphasis on the role of propaganda and disinformation in shaping public perception of the war on terror.
He accuses the media of being complicit in spreading fabricated terror threats and manipulating information, even alleging the CIA's involvement in this disinformation campaign.
Chossudovsky offers specific examples to support these claims, like the portrayal of Abu Musab al-Zarqawi as a terrorist mastermind, with links to both al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein, a figure used to justify the Iraq War. He even questions the legitimacy of the ricin threat in the UK and an alleged chemical attack plot in Jordan, portraying them as fabricated events designed to manipulate public opinion and further specific agendas.
This all ties back to the book's overarching theme, a critique of what Chossudovsky calls the American empire. He paints a picture of a powerful entity seeking global dominance through militarization, economic control, and carefully crafted manipulation.
He even criticizes what he calls left accommodation, arguing that social movements were co-opted, preventing genuine opposition to this agenda. He sees this left accommodation as a failure to effectively challenge the dominant narrative and hold power to account.
He's essentially calling for a mass movement to challenge the legitimacy of this so-called New World Order that he believes is being orchestrated.
Now let's focus on a particular event that Chossudovsky analyzes in detail, the London '77 bombings. He presents this event as a potential turning point in the war on terror narrative and raises several questions about the alleged ties of the York bombers to Pakistan and al-Qaeda, particularly highlighting the role of Naim Noor Khan, a figure who allegedly facilitated their travel to Pakistan for training.
He delves into the alleged involvement of Harun Rashid Aswat, another key figure in the plot, suggesting a connection to MI6, the British intelligence agency. This raises questions about potential double agents and the complexity of the intelligence world.
And there's this intriguing detail about Atlantic Blue, a mock terror drill conducted on London's transportation system just months before the '77 attacks. Chossudovsky seems to imply that these drills were more than just preparation, hinting at a more sinister possibility.
It definitely feeds into that sense of a larger pre-planned narrative that he's trying to convey throughout the book. So having looked at all of this, what key takeaways can we glean from Chossudovsky's America's War on Terrorism, especially in the context of bin Laden's worldview?
Well, it paints a very specific and unsettling picture, doesn't it? One where the U.S. is pulling the strings, manipulating events, and potentially even using terrorism as a tool to achieve its objectives. It's a world of hidden agendas, powerful forces operating in the shadows, and a constant flow of propaganda designed to shape public perception.
And while it's just one perspective, it's crucial to understand how these ideas and claims might have resonated with bin Laden and his followers.
Absolutely. It provides valuable insights into the information that was circulating within his inner circle, shaping their understanding of the world and potentially influencing their actions. It makes you wonder, why would bin Laden have this particular book in his possession? What was he hoping to gain from it?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
We know Chossudovsky's book is full of accusations against the U.S. government, alleging everything from covert operations to manipulating global events.
Right.
Was he using it to validate his existing beliefs? Or perhaps to justify his actions to his followers, presenting this as evidence of a grand conspiracy against Islam?
Yeah, it's certainly possible. Remember, the book portrays the U.S. as this domineering empire driven by self-interest and willing to use any means necessary to achieve its goals.
Right.
That narrative could have been incredibly potent for bin Laden, feeding into his sense of righteousness. It could have allowed him to frame the conflict as a battle between good and evil, Islam against the West.
And don't forget, the entire chapter Chossudovsky dedicates to the American pursuit of economic dominance, particularly through controlling oil and gas resources. He directly links the war on terror to this pursuit, especially in strategically important regions like Central Asia.
Yeah, that narrative of Western exploitation and imperialism would have resonated deeply with bin Laden, who already viewed the U.S. presence in the Middle East with suspicion.
It's important to remember that this is just one book from bin Laden's extensive library. There's a treasure trove of other documents and materials recovered from his compound waiting to be explored.
But even this one book offers us a valuable glimpse into the kind of information bin Laden was consuming and how it might have shaped his understanding of the world.
It makes you think about what other books or documents were influencing his decisions, what other narratives were feeding into his ideology.
And that's precisely what we'll be delving into in our next episode as we continue exploring bin Laden's bookshelf. We'll try to piece together his worldview and seek a deeper understanding of the motivations behind his actions.
So stay tuned for more. This journey into the mind of one of history's most controversial figures is bound to be both fascinating and unsettling.
And it may even lead us to question our own understanding of the war on terror and the events that have shaped our world over the past 2 decades.
Now, circling back to some of the specific claims made in America's War on Terrorism, one of the most provocative is the assertion that al-Qaeda, bin Laden's own organization, was actually a product of U.S. foreign policy, trained and nurtured by the CIA.
Right, this claim, while controversial, is central to the book's narrative. Chossudovsky argues that the U.S. government essentially created the very monster it was now trying to destroy.
And while it's crucial to emphasize that this claim lacks substantial evidence and is disputed by many, understanding how such a claim might have been perceived by bin Laden and his followers is crucial to our exploration.
Absolutely. Even if taken as false, these claims could have provided bin Laden with a sense of justification for his actions. He could have easily seen himself as a victim of U.S. imperialism, fighting back against an oppressive force that had wronged him.
And the book throws in some very specific details that could have reinforced this narrative, such as the alleged meeting between bin Laden and a CIA agent in Dubai just weeks before 9/11.
Oh, yeah. Whether true or not, details like these would have cemented bin Laden's belief in a powerful, shadowy enemy controlling events from behind the scenes.
And this neatly ties into Chossudovsky's broader critique of the American empire and its alleged thirst for global dominance through militarization, economic manipulation,
Yeah.
and carefully orchestrated propaganda.
It's a narrative that aligns perfectly with anti-imperialist sentiments and likely appealed to bin Laden's worldview.
Chossudovsky also delves into specific events that bin Laden likely used to justify his actions, such as the U.S. involvement in Bosnia and Kosovo. The book argues that the U.S. government, on one hand, supported Islamic militants in these conflicts, only to label them as terrorists later on.
He even goes so far as to claim that the U.S. government intentionally allowed thousands of al-Qaeda fighters to escape from Afghanistan after the initial invasion.
These claims, regardless of their veracity, fit perfectly into the narrative that bin Laden probably wanted to believe, a narrative in which the U.S. was a duplicitous and untrustworthy enemy.
And that brings us to the very heart of this deep dive, attempting to understand the world as bin Laden saw it.
While we in no way condone his actions, we're trying to grasp the information and narratives that could have influenced his thinking, that might have shaped his decisions.
It's a challenging and unsettling endeavor, but it's essential if we want to understand the roots of the conflict and the events that continue to shape our world today.
Now, shifting our focus to a particularly disturbing aspect of Chossudovsky's book, his claims about the war on terror and its negative impact on civil liberties. He argues that this war was used as a pretext to erode personal freedoms and establish a police state both within the U.S. and globally.
He specifically points to the Patriot Act, a piece of legislation passed in the U.S. immediately after 9/11 as evidence of this erosion of freedoms. Chossudovsky argues that the Patriot Act grants the government sweeping surveillance powers and essentially criminalizes dissent.
And he doesn't stop there. He claims that the war on terror led to a resurgence of what he calls the Inquisition in the West, drawing parallels between the historical Inquisition and modern-day surveillance practices. He argues that both are ultimately aimed at suppressing dissent and enforcing conformity.
He even uses the detention camps at Guantanamo Bay as an example of this modern-day Inquisition, claiming these camps are used to detain and torture individuals without due process.
These are serious accusations. And whether or not one agrees with Chossudovsky's analysis, it's crucial to consider the potential impact of these claims on someone like bin Laden.
Yeah, it's easy to see how these claims could have strengthened his conviction that the West was fundamentally hostile towards Islam and that violence was the only way to resist this perceived oppression.
Remember, bin Laden and his followers saw themselves as defenders of Islam, as warriors fighting against a global crusade targeting their faith.
And Chossudovsky's book, with its claims of a Western Inquisition and the systematic erosion of freedoms, could have easily provided further justification for their violent ideology.
It's a stark reminder of the powerful impact of propaganda and disinformation, how it can shape perceptions and fuel conflict.
And it underscores the importance of critical thinking and questioning official narratives, especially during times of crisis when emotions run high and information can be easily manipulated.
Now, let's examine a specific event that Chossudovsky analyzes in detail, the 2003 invasion of Iraq. This event undoubtedly played a significant role in shaping global perceptions of the war on terror.
Chossudovsky argues that this invasion was built on a foundation of lies and deception, particularly the Bush administration's claims that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction. He accuses the administration of fabricating evidence to create a pretext for war.
He also points fingers at the media for their role in spreading this alleged disinformation. He claims that many media outlets uncritically repeated the Bush administration's claims about Iraqi WMDs, effectively becoming a mouthpiece for propaganda.
And this is where Chossudovsky's narrative would have likely resonated with bin Laden. Bin Laden, like many in the Middle East and around the world, saw the invasion of Iraq as an act of unprovoked aggression, an attack on a sovereign nation based on false pretenses.
Right.
Chossudovsky's claims of fabricated evidence and media manipulation would have reinforced this perception, further fueling bin Laden's anger and resentment towards the West.
It's crucial to remember that bin Laden viewed the U.S. presence in the Middle East as a form of occupation and exploitation, an unwelcome intrusion driven by self-interest.
The invasion of Iraq, in his eyes, was just another chapter in the long history of Western imperialism, another attempt to control the region's resources and impose Western will on Muslim populations.
And Chossudovsky's book, with its focus on the alleged lies and deception surrounding the Iraq War, likely provided bin Laden with ammunition for his own justifications for violence.
It serves as a sobering reminder that even wars fought with seemingly good intentions can have unintended and far-reaching consequences, potentially breeding resentment, creating new enemies, and perpetuating cycles of violence.
And it highlights the critical importance of considering multiple perspectives,
Right.
questioning official narratives, and thoroughly examining the evidence before embarking on military interventions, as the ramifications can be significant and enduring.
Okay, so we've really unpacked a lot of Chossudovsky's claims, many of which are, as we said, definitely controversial. But, I think it's important to consider the broader context here, like what was happening in the world at that time that might have further influenced bin Laden's thinking.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The early 2000s was a period of major geopolitical shifts, right? The collapse of the Soviet Union had left, this massive power vacuum, and the U.S. was stepping in to assert itself as the sole superpower.
And that's something that Chossudovsky really emphasizes in the book. He portrays the U.S. as this expanding empire, constantly seeking to extend its influence and control around the globe. He even suggests that the war on terror was part of this larger strategy.
Right.
He specifically points to U.S. involvement in Central Asia and the Caucasus, regions that are rich in oil and gas resources. Chossudovsky argues that the U.S. was primarily interested in controlling these resources and the strategic pipelines that run through the region, using the war on terror as a convenient justification for military intervention.
I see how that narrative would have resonated with bin Laden's, anti-Western sentiment. He likely saw the U.S. presence in the Middle East as nothing more than a continuation of colonial exploitation, another attempt to dominate and control resources.
Absolutely, and framing the war on terror as a fight against Islamic extremism would have only reinforced his belief that the West was fundamentally opposed to Islam, further fueling his sense of grievance and the need for resistance.
And Chossudovsky also criticizes what he calls left accommodation in the West, arguing that, that many on the left failed to effectively challenge the U.S. government's narrative about the war on terror.
Right. He suggests that this lack of strong opposition emboldened the Bush administration, allowing them to pursue their agenda largely unchecked.
That's an interesting point. It makes me wonder if bin Laden might have interpreted this lack of unified dissent in the West as a sign of weakness. Perhaps it reinforced his belief that violence was the only truly effective means of achieving his goals.
It's certainly possible. And remember, Chossudovsky's book was published in 2005, several years after the 9/11 attacks and the invasion of Iraq. By that point, public opinion about the war on terror was starting to shift, both within the U.S. and internationally.
Right. More people were beginning to question the Bush administration's motives and tactics, and there was growing concern about the erosion of civil liberties.
Exactly. And bin Laden may have seen this shift in public opinion as a validation of his own worldview. It could have fueled his sense of righteousness and conviction that he was on the right side of history, even as his methods became increasingly extreme.
It's such a complex and multifaceted situation. We're still, I think, we're still trying to unravel all the threads and understand how various factors might have influenced bin Laden's thinking.
But by exploring his library, even just this one book, we gain a valuable glimpse into the information and narratives that were shaping his worldview.
It reminds us how crucial it is to understand our adversaries, their motivations, and their perceptions, if we truly want to resolve conflicts and prevent future tragedies.
It also underscores the importance of critical thinking, questioning official narratives, and seeking out diverse perspectives. We can't simply accept information at face value. We have to dig deeper, examine the evidence, and consider alternative viewpoints.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into bin Laden's bookshelf, I'm left with a question. Given what we've learned about his worldview, how can we apply these insights to understanding the world we live in today?
That's the ultimate challenge, isn't it? There are no easy answers, but one thing's for sure, we can't underestimate the power of narratives, the impact of propaganda, and the importance of understanding those who see the world differently than we do.
Perhaps by making the effort to truly understand, the motivations and perceptions of those we consider our adversaries, we can start to bridge divides, build empathy, and ultimately work towards a more peaceful future.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of While We Were Distracted. We will continue our dive into documents and books found in the bin Laden compound that have been released by CIA. To see the full dump, check the description and comments or visit the CIA library at cia.gov. Don't forget to like and subscribe for the next episode on While We Were Distracted.